If you pay any attention to current events, you know who these guys are. These high school students from Parkland, Florida, are sparking a national movement to reform gun laws in this country. They are using direct action, like school walkouts, marching in the streets, speaking out, and generally making a lot of uncomfortable noise. But do you know who these guys are? In 1960, these were the high school students acting out and speaking up. These kids from Chapel Hill's segregated black school, the revered Lincoln High School, staged the first sit-in in Chapel Hill on February 28, 1960. They didn't have adult approval or support. They did it anyway, and they sparked a movement. For the next 4 years, there was marching in the street, direct action, and lots of uncomfortable noise. By 1964, the work begun by kids like these resulted in the signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act by President Lyndon Johnson, which ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This act is considered one of the crowning legislative achievements of the civil rights movement. But how do we know what happened over 50 years ago? We know because of primary sources. Today we're going to learn about primary source material and why these are so important to historical research and to getting a better understanding of our own community history. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to apply critical thinking skills when engaging with primary sources, know where and how to access local history resources about civil rights in Chapel Hill, and contribute to a shared repository of primary sources. First up, let's get our definitions straight. Primary sources are the raw materials of history, original documents and objects which were created at the time under study. They include objects and artifacts, photographs, letters, personal papers, newspaper reports, oral histories, and much more. Secondary sources are accounts or interpretations of events created by someone, generally an academic, without first-hand experience. These include history books and articles, basically the things we read in our school history classes or might find in our local public library. Historians rely on primary source material to create their work. Let's try our hand at this kind of history work by examining a few primary sources. And here's where you can choose your own adventure. You can either pause and take a just for fun primary source quiz. This is helpful in assessing for yourself whether or not you have a good handle on the differences between primary and secondary sources. Or you can move directly on to learning how to engage with primary sources. Choose now. Hey, you chose the quiz. Nice. I like that commitment. Here's what you need to do. Sort the stack of images into either primary sources or secondary sources. You'll do that with the click and drag method of just moving the image where you want it to go. Confused? Let me know. When you're done, just click, I'm done. I've got 3 examples of primary sources here, and you can choose to look at any or all of these to learn more about the source and also to learn about the critical questions you should be asking when engaging with primary source material. It's important that you look at least one of these sources so that you can get a sense about what kinds of questions you should be asking. Remember, you are the historian in these cases, and these are the raw material of history. Just click on the item of interest to learn more. When you're ready to move on, click I'm done. So this is the first primary source I wanted to share with you. It's a full-page ad that was run in the Chapel Hill newspaper in 1964. I've given you a little bit of background earlier in this video that should give you some context for this ad, but take a moment now to engage with it yourself. Ask yourself some questions. Who created this primary source? What do I already know about the time and place that produced this item? Does this fit with your prior knowledge? When was it created? Where was it created? Displayed or consumed? Why was it created? Who was the audience? And what can you learn from this? And by the way, I've already shown you this primary source, but you probably didn't notice. I didn't. But check this image out. You can examine another primary source by clicking on either of the other choices, or you can, if you're finished and ready to move on, just click I'm done. This primary source is a pamphlet that was circulated at an organizer meetings in Chapel Hill in the 1960s. Ask yourself some questions as you engage with it. Again, who created this source? What do you already know about the time and place that produced this item? Does it fit with your prior knowledge? When was it created? Where was it created, displayed, or consumed? Look for some religious references in this particular pamphlet. Most organizing meetings took place in churches, organizations critical in the success of this movement. Why was it created? Who was the audience? And what can you learn from this? You might add a few more questions in to help guide your research. What do you see that you didn't expect? What feelings and thoughts does the primary source trigger in you? And what questions does it raise? Once you're finished, you can examine another source or move on by clicking I'm done. The third source I have is an oral history example. An oral history is an interview with someone who experienced, lived through, or participated in historical events or time periods under study. Oral histories are vital resources, but they also require a bit more critical thought because we've added a couple of other elements. One is time. Interviews often happen years after the events have passed, and sometimes they aren't remembered perfectly. And the other is the interviewer. Think about the power dynamics between the two people in conversation. This example is an excerpt from an oral history done with Quentin Baker, one of the young leaders of the civil rights movement in Chapel Hill. This clip is just under 5 minutes long. If you want to come back and listen later, that's fine, of course. You can listen to the whole interview, which is about 2 hours long, or read the transcript in the link below the audio controls. Again, remember your who, what, when, where, why questions, and also consider the relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee. This interview was recorded in 2002, so many years after the events discussed. And I chose this particular clip because Mr. Baker challenges some assumptions people may have about the Black community's attitude toward being gay. And of course, after you're finished, you can either examine another source or move on by clicking I'm done. In addition to some of the sources I've shared with you, I've collected many more on our group site. You can access that site by clicking here. Next, I'm going to demonstrate why this site is important to our work. So on this site, you can read more about some of the inspiring and moving stories from the movement. On the site menu, you can navigate the different sections of the site, and I encourage you to spend some time here and read through everything. I'm going to focus right now on this scholars page. Here I've collected local history resources and pointed to a few important collection and local history archives. I recommend reading through some of these articles to get a good overview of the history of the movement. This first one in particular by Dr. Marcellus Barksdale is not super long, but it is very informative about exactly what was going on in Chapel Hill from 1960 to 1965. But there are other great resources here. Sally Green's intro to this panel is very valuable, and she actually talks to Quentin Baker in that panel, so you might remember him. And then finally, I wanted to show you some places where you can access some primary sources. The first is the oral histories from the Southern Oral History Program at UNC. These, most of these are online, so you can listen to them from the comfort of your own home. But there are some that you do actually have to travel to listen to. But there are hundreds of great, rich histories from the people who were there. And I've linked to a couple of projects that have dozens of histories available for you to listen to, but there are many more. So spend some time exploring that archive. And then I've pulled out a few archival papers that are housed in the Southern Historical Collection. There are a lot more than what I've listed here. So again, I would encourage you to look through different finding aids to find out what else is out there. A couple I wanted to point out, John Ely's papers. John Ely wrote the book The Free Men, which is the definitive history as written about the civil rights movement in Chapel Hill. And he's got some photographs that have not been digitized in his papers, so those would be a great thing to include in a shared repository. The other thing I wanted to point to is John Kenyon Chapman's papers. He wrote his dissertation specifically on the youth movement in the civil rights struggle in Chapel Hill, and he interviewed a lot of the young people who were part of that movement. And these interviews are really great. They're not that old, and they're hard to find anywhere else. So definitely recommend checking those out. Lots of great photographs and other papers for you to look through there too. The Chapel Hill Historical Society also has a few things of interest. There's a whole collection of audio cassette recordings that have not been digitized or transcribed, so that could be just a really interesting project to listen to some of these recordings that date back to the 1970s. I'm sure you would be doing a lot of researchers a big favor if you chose that route. Then they have lots of copies of the Lincoln Echo, which was the student paper at the Lincoln High School, the Black High School in Chapel Hill. They have their big broadsheets laminated. Those are really fun to look through. And finally, I wanted to point to the Daily Tar Heel archives, which are available online via the Digital NC. These are great because the Chapel Hill News was the official newspaper of Chapel Hill, and it was not a great source for finding information about what was going on in the civil rights movement, especially in the early days. They did not cover it very much. Unlike the Daily Tar Heel, which did write extensively about the civil rights movement. There were a lot of students at UNC that were involved, and they also have some amazing photographs in the archives. A lot of the best photography that was done in Chapel Hill around the civil rights movement comes from staff photographers from the Daily Tar Heel. So definitely recommend checking that out. So once you find a primary source that speaks to you and your interests in this project, whether it's a photograph, an oral history, a pamphlet, I want you to make sure first that it's in digital form. If it doesn't already exist in digital form, get it there. You can do that by just taking a picture of it or scanning something. And then I want you to share that file with the rest of us in this group. And to do that, you come back up to the menu of this site and click on Shared Repository. This is a very simple way of sharing files. I've just created a Google form with one thing on it, and that is a file upload. So if I click on Fill Out the Form, the first thing you'll have to do is put in your email address. And this is just to make sure that we're not getting a bunch of spammy files uploaded. And then I'm going to add a file. And you can add files from your own Google Drive, or if you've got them saved on your computer, you can add them from your computer. And I'm going to add this first picture from the civil rights movement. And once it's uploaded, you still have to click upload, and then you click submit. And you can add more than one response. In fact, you'll need to, because you'll also be sharing your reflection, whether that's an audio file or a written file. But you can also look and see what your classmates have uploaded. I'm going to, you can see this MC Luby has uploaded a lot of things. I'm going to just check this and see what we find. And you should be able to see the file that I just uploaded. And there it is. This is an image of the Durham to Chapel Hill Walk for Freedom. So that's what you're each going to do. Again, if you have questions or any problems, just contact me. So now it's time to put all of what you've learned together and get to work. First, do some background reading on the movement in Chapel Hill. Use the resources listed on our group website. After you've done some background reading, spend some time looking through primary sources. Find one that you'd like to share with the group, something that's meaningful to you. Primary sources include photographs, documents like letters, flyers, posters, newspaper clippings, advertisements, and of course, oral histories. If you find a primary source that you'd like to share that's not in a digital format, take a picture of it so that you can share it with the class through our shared repository. And that's the next thing you'll do. Upload your source as a digital file to our shared repository. And then the last thing I'd like you to do is to write or record an audio file with a brief reflection on your primary source. Remember your critical questions: who, what, when, where, why. Upload that file as well to the shared repository. If you have any questions about how to record an audio file and want to do it and don't know how, just let me know. Got it? You know what to do. Click, move on. And there you have it. I hope now you feel confident in your new skills and can apply critical thinking when engaging with primary sources, know where and how to access local history resources about the civil rights movement in Chapel Hill, and contribute to a shared repository of primary sources. Remember, primary sources are the raw material of history. Often in community history, primary sources are the best way to learn about the place and people you encounter every day. Learning about your community history is a vital part of developing your voice and engaging with your world. These kids did it. These kids are doing it. You're next. What are you going to do?